Hello and welcome to the Middle East Teaching and Learning Conference 2021. My name is Charlotte Dawson and today I'm going to be speaking to you about connecting the UAE schools to nature. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, just drop me a message in the Q&A section on the app. So the title of my presentation today, From Dugong to Hoopoe, is about two of the species that hold a special importance to me. So when I first joined the UAE around 10 years ago, one of the first species that I saw or came across was the hoopoe bird, and obviously it looks so different to any of the other birds I'd ever seen in the UK before. So it's really poignant as part of connecting to my local nature here in Dubai. And the dugong, of course, the dugong is a species that I've only recently begun to learn about, and that's through the UAE's module of social studies that we've started to learn in schools. So hoopoe was one of the first animals that I learned about, and the dugong is one of the most recent. So for any of those who are unfamiliar with my background, so I have a teaching qualification from the University of Wolverhampton, and I recently last year graduated with an MBA in educational leadership from the University of Tampere, Finland. So I've been a teacher since 2011. I'm also an academic writer and researcher for various topics to do with education. I've just qualified with my master's degree, and I run an environmental group in the UAE. So we're called EnviroEd UAE, and it's a group of, it's a network, I suppose, of people like teachers, school leaders, and we also have a few environmental experts too. And when I wrote my thesis as well for university, that was on the topic of connecting students to nature. So everything I do really is to do with environments, education, and research. So before we get into things today, I just want to run you through a few of the keywords that we're going to be looking at. So I know that there's a lot of terminology to do with this new area of learning. So ecological literacy focuses on the creation of sustainable human communities and society. So that's to do with the sustainable actions and the things that we can do as people to ensure processes are more sustainable. Environmental literacy, so a slightly older term here, it's more about awareness and concern, looking at solutions and prevention. So along the same lines, but slightly different. Environmental education is the area that I work a lot with. So it's more of a lifelong process. It's interdisciplinary, which means that it's not only teachers, it's not only environmental experts, but it's about bringing all those people together for part of this active participation and really having a group responsibility for the environment. And we're all learning from each other. And obviously what we're all setting out to achieve is this connection to nature. So you may see this referred to in other academic pieces as CTN. So our CTN is to do with it's basically based upon the biophilia hypothesis from Edward Wilson many years ago. And it's to do with our humans' innate tendency to seek connections with nature. So it's not this new trend, as you will. It's something that's always been in humanity, but it's about digging below the surface and emerging with this connection to nature that has always been around, but sometimes it's forgotten about in our day-to-day life. So a connection to nature, if you were to have one, is stable over time, and because it's innate and it's inbuilt, it can go with you across various situations. So it's not something you only experience as a child, but something that goes on into adulthood and as you grow older as well. So the ABCs, it's affective, so your sense of care for the environment. It's behavioural, so it's your commitment to protecting and looking after that environment and the behaviours that you do to be able to enable that. And it's cognitive as well, so how your mind is integrated with nature and how much you feel you are connected to it. So I just wanted to run you through a little bit of my master's thesis, which was called Connecting International Schools to Nature. And I called it International Schools, but really the main focus was on our private schools in Dubai. And there was 32 benefits for connecting students to nature from the findings. So my findings took place, I carried this research out over the course of about 2 years. And over that time, I spoke to many different, it was over 50 in the end, respondents who had been teaching for different amounts of time. Some people were new to the field, some people were international teachers, some based in Dubai. So from those surveys and from speaking to those individuals, we found that there were 32 benefits for getting students connected to nature. And the most common were meeting children's, or the most commonly referenced were meeting children's physical and developmental needs. So making it really applicable to the individual child's needs. Whereas second to that came as encouraging that appreciation of nature. So across all the people that I spoke to, firstly, they thought it was important for the child, and secondly, they thought it was important for nature. But people also acknowledged that there was currently some barriers in terms of getting children connected to our natural environment here. So the most commonly reported barriers were curriculum pressure, so pressure to keep up with targets, curriculum development stages, reporting, and also teacher capability and confidence. So a lot of teachers also reported that they would love to find out more about this part of learning, and they recognise the benefits of it, but some teachers unfortunately felt that they didn't know where to start. They felt like they needed a lot of equipment that they didn't have. They felt like other expectations were put on them as opposed to enabling children to connect to the outdoors. So I think really as school leaders, that's what we need to be focusing on how can we best prepare our teachers? How can we relieve some of that curriculum pressure, maybe by re-looking at our curriculums and seeing if there are natural links that can emerge from them, as opposed to seeing this nature connection as an additional layer on top of a curriculum. It should be fully integrated. So a quote here that I'd like to share from you by Richard Louv. So we cannot protect something we do not love, we cannot love what we do not know, and we cannot know what we do not see or hear or sense. And I think that really drives home the message of what I'd like to achieve. So elements of CTN, elements of connecting to nature. So I'd just like to share this one with you. So elements of connecting to nature, what would that look like? So it would look like environmentally responsible behaviour. It would look like opportunities for enjoyment. It would look like understanding culture and heritage. It would look like an awareness of local ecosystems. And it would look like students recognising those connections, and teachers too. Okay, so the next element of CTN I'd like to speak to you about today is that of environmentally responsible behaviour, otherwise known as ERB. So having environmentally responsible behaviour means that you are acting or behaving in a way that is responsible to the environment. So an example of that would be, so if you are potentially about to encroach on an animal's natural habitat. So if you are acting in a way that was environmentally responsible, you'd stop before you are about to take that action. You'd think about how it would affect the species that are living in that area, and then you would change your behaviour accordingly. So an example might be if you are on a beach and you see some type of marine life, you might see some a group of small crabs, for example. So if you are acting in a way that's environmentally responsible, you may, instead of picking the crabs up and moving them around, you might decide that it would be more responsible to that environment to instead point at the crabs, have a look where they are, and you can walk away and leave them. That would be behaving in a way that's environmentally responsible. So having respect for those species and for the environment as in general, having humility and empathy towards the species that you come across. So behaving in a way that is responsible. Research has also shown that when you behave in a way that's environmentally responsible, it can also have an impact on your consumption levels. So when I refer to consumption levels, I'm talking about your water consumption, your energy consumption, and it may also have an impact on your food consumption. So you may say that if you are having this empathy for the natural environment, you might also begin to think about, well, if I use an unnecessary amount of water, which habitats would that have an impact on? And if there is a general need for more electricity, what would be the outcome of that? Where would we generate that additional electricity? So research is beginning to find that when you have this ERB, then you are more likely to have a conservative attitude to consumption levels. And when I mentioned about food as well, obviously things like farming and any way of creating food sources, that will have an impact on the natural environment. So if you are not wasting food, if you are only purchasing that you will eat and actually use, it's responsible consumption. So you're behaving in an environmentally responsible way. So opportunities for enjoyment. So there are many opportunities for enjoyment that students could find in schools, outside of schools, with parents. And the icons that I've put below for beach schools and forest schools, some of you may be familiar with. So forest schools, I know, is a very popular movement across Europe. And beach schools, probably not as many people are as familiar with. But the reason I decided to use both is that even though forest schools is it's sort of our go-to outdoor experiences, area, I suppose. What we have in the Gulf region isn't necessarily appropriate to use in forest schools. So we have mangrove areas, but we don't really have forests as such. So this is why I've said that perhaps beach schools, we can apply some of the concepts that we've learned about in forest schools, and we can apply them in beach schools. As I said earlier, some of my research found that teachers were lacking a bit of confidence. Maybe they needed a little bit more training to help them feel like they were more secure in delivering this type of provision. So even though we may have forest schools training, it may be an opportunity to look into some of the things that beach schools are doing, or even to adapt some of the forest schools' sort of pedagogy and ways of thinking to our environment here. So sort of keep those in mind. If you are trained in forest schools, if you do have an understanding of that, and also an understanding of beach schools, try and bear those both in mind as I'm going through the points here. So nature, recreation and playing. So obviously that's the key way, probably the first way that any of us experience nature. So recreation, simply, you might just go for a walk. You might take a ball and go and play in a field. You might build as I said, like rock pooling or pond dipping. So many different ways. Just observing the type of nature that we do have and the biodiversity that we do have. Many people are of the impression that because Dubai and the UAE is largely a desert landscape, that means that we don't have the biodiversity as other areas. It is there. It's just being able to explore it and find where different things are located. So observing and studying is a brilliant way to enjoy the area. Collecting and displaying ecological elements. So that's a brilliant one for classrooms, especially in the summer months, when it's too hot to go outside and enjoy these natural locations firsthand. You can bring some of those elements into your classroom or in different parts to your school. So you might have in your class, you might have like a display that has different natural features for children to enjoy playing with, tactile things they can manipulate. You might have, trying to think back to some of the brilliant examples that I've seen now, you might have a goat's skull, for example. I know that my 2-year-old was enthralled by the idea of seeing an animal's skull, and then that really latches on to different discussions about, what's inside us and what's inside animals, and does everybody have bones? So things like that. There's so many learning opportunities that can come from them, but really, igniting that curiosity and exploration is key, really, as well. So collecting and displaying elements, you might decide to make a piece of artwork out of them, you might make a 3D model, or really just explore the colours and the textiles there. So small scale cultivation, again, that's another one where we have to really think about the environment that we have here in the UAE. So it might be a very different conversation if we were based in a different part of the world. However, our climate here is largely hot and humid. And then we have some time around the winter months, which is really pleasant to be outside. So what I would suggest is to really look into our options during those hotter months. There's been so many places that I've been to visit recently where people have said, oh, sorry, but it's the hot time of the year. Yep, that's absolutely understandable. And it's just about looking at options for that hot time. Obviously, it is extraordinarily hot during the summer, so potentially don't spend so much time with children out there. Mornings are also, maybe look for opportunities early morning, going into evening, maybe go on a morning walk outside of school hours. There's lots of opportunities still. But I would say in terms of cultivation, maybe look at options such as hydroponic gardening during those hotter months, or also look at investing in some shaded areas. I've also seen at a local organic farm, they have this brilliant I know there's a name for it. It's like where the water comes down and the fan sort of spreads that moisture around as well. So that could be another area. I've seen at the zoos and areas as well where they have like mist that comes down to keep people cool. But I think, look at your options, look at your setting and your finances and what your situation is to look at how you can really develop that small scale cultivation across the year. And in terms of the winter months as well, similarly to the UK, we do have seasons. So look at your crop rotation across the year and look at what species of plant life would grow at different parts of the year. I know, for example, from my own experience, radishes grow well, mint grows well, tomatoes grow well. There's a million and one other things. Peppers I've grown as well. Cotton absolutely does amazingly over here as well. So there are things that you can plant here. Don't feel like because it's too hot that you can't do it. It's just having a go with it, really, and involving children with that investigation as well. So moving on, another element of connecting to nature is looking for those explicit connections. So things like actively tuning into the environment, practicing mindfulness techniques. And I'm going to relate this to the point at the bottom as well. So if you're tuning into your environment and looking at the way it makes you feel as a human, then that can also link into your creative response to that environment as well. So if you are out, say, one of those early mornings and it's a little bit chilly, and you might say, it's windy today, it's a bit breezy. So then begin to, once you've done that initial reflection, you might say, okay, well, how do the animals cope with that? Do they have a thicker coat? Or do they sit out in the sun in the morning? And similarly to plants, if it is a windy day, are they built with a stronger stem to try and counteract that breezy day, or do they just fall flat? So that creative response, once you're recognizing it in yourself, then you're recognizing it in other creatures, and then that can help you with your paintings. You might decide to paint what a flower looks like on a windy day, or you might decide to do a dance of a plant on that windy day, or compared to what it's like on a hot, humid summer day. You might decide to look at a stream and look at how that changes across the course of a year. And you might say, oh, well, this is the sound of, a pebble dropping into a stream and it makes the bloop. So your creative response might be to do with sound. And you might make a piece of music developing on that bloop sound. You might say, are there any instruments that naturally make that sound? Or do we have to record it involving maybe some digital media and make a tune that way? Really, the possibilities are endless. You can be a creative as the children in your class. But I think the other two elements on recognizing connections also are important too. So like reading, watching videos, studying, looking for other learning opportunities. So you've got this sort of self-reflection element, and which feeds into the creativity. But on the flip side of that, you also have the sort of academic learning about things. So say like I did with the hoopoe bird, you've seen it, you want to find out what it's called, where it's come from, what its name is. that's the other side of the learning. So it's not only about seeing and thinking, yep, that's lovely, that's great. It's also about having that depth as well. So finding out, you've got that hook, you've got them interested, so let's find a little bit more about what that bird is called or what that animal eats, for example. So another element of connecting to nature, I'm going to just share this quote with you. It's one of my favourites. On land and in the sea, our forefathers lived and survived in this environment. They were able to do so because they recognised the need to conserve it, to take from it only what they needed to live, and to preserve it for succeeding generations. And that's a quote from Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan. Now, I believe it is important to, when you're looking at a nature connection, to look at not only the environmental past, the natural history, but to also look at the human side of the history too. So, for example, from my own history, you might say that the area where I come from, it's a rural county called Shropshire in the UK. You might say that in our history, it was a previous mining town where people used the natural resources and didn't really have much understanding about the natural landscape, really. They were using it really for their economic benefit. We had to learn from that, and from then onwards, really, after the mining ceased to be, we began to redevelop those areas. We took part in a lot of rewilding, and as such, now the county is very green. But it had to be that we reflected on our past to move on from it, to learn from it, and to realise how we could do things differently. And I think that is part of learning about the human history of the area and how it impacts on the natural history of the area. So although looking at the Gulf region and the history would be very different in this area, I think it's important to look at how the human impact has a consequence on the natural environment. So as I mentioned before about the mining and the impact that would have on my local area in my home country, in a similar sense, you might say in the Gulf region, having Bedouin lifestyles, how has that impacted on the nature that we have here? So you might say that it has had an impact on biodiversity, and it could be in a positive way or a negative way. Species that were larger in number than they are currently, and you could also intertwine the human history in to see why that would be. So say, for example, there would be more marine life, for example, and you could look at why that might be. Areas that have been developed and some of the natural habitats that have had to be changed or moved. And I think it is important to have an understanding of where an area has come from. Biophilic design there, as we can see that the harbour, or Dubai Creek Harbour, is going to be remodelled with elements of a desert landscape. So reminding people who come to visit and passers-by that this isn't just a metropolis, this isn't just a modern city, but we are also respective of our heritage too. Okay, so relating the human history to the natural history. So many people believe, and a lot of research tells us this too, that Dubai is simply a desert landscape. And looking at our ecosystems, desert ecosystems do take up 80% of the UAE's surface. So we are largely a desert ecosystem. However, we do need to consider that there are mountains and wetlands and marine ecosystems too. So looking at the life that we have on land as well as in sea, linking to the Sustainable Development Goals. So building on from that, really, here's just an example of some of the local biodiversity that we do have in this region. So as you can see, we have 39 different species of terrestrial mammals and 58 species of marine life. So there definitely are more opportunities to research and explore, but that's a good starting point for children beginning to learn about the national heritage, really, of the UAE. So in summary, what have we found out today? So we need to allow opportunities for enjoyment, whether that's through play or whether it's through curriculum links, whether it's through exploration of tactile resources in classrooms, whether it's through observation of wildlife, or whether that's through study and watching like Attenborough documentaries. However children choose to enjoy nature, that's what we should be encouraging. We should be promoting an understanding of culture and heritage. So, as I've said, the natural history as well as the human history and how the two are intertwined. We should be developing an awareness of local ecosystems so that we're not only a desert landscape here in Dubai, but that we're also wetlands, we're also marine, we're also mountains. We need to look at the type of biodiversity that enriches those areas too. We need to recognise the connections between ourselves and that natural environment to engage in mindful activities and our creative response. So in that regard, educators must be a role model. They must be willing to learn. They must be able to admit that they are not the all-knowing experts. They're still exploring themselves. We all know that we, as expats, are not as familiar with this landscape as we would be with our home landscapes. And I think it's important to share that with children as well, that we are an international group of expats and we have knowledge of other places, but we're all still learning about the UAE. And then I think something that we do have as a strength here is our environmentally responsible behaviours. I do believe that many schools, both locally and further afar, do have this ERB as a strength. So things like turning off the light switches. I think pretty much every school you go into, it's switching off the light switches when you're not in the room, turning off the taps when you're not using them, sorry. And things like keeping the air conditioning at a stable temperature throughout the school, having that understanding of how we can be conscious with our consumption, I think is a strength. But it's really having that depth of understanding. Why are we cautious about how much electricity we use? Why are we keeping our air conditioning at constant temperature? What's the impact of me using too much water? Which habitats is that going to have an impact on? Why aren't I wasteful with how much food I eat? And where does my food come from? Big conversations that I think really help to give this responsible behaviour and a depth of understanding. So thank you for listening today. If you would like to join our network, just drop me an email at the message here, or you can visit the website. These are the things that we've learnt about to date. So we have looked at UAE biodiversity. We've looked at how to connect to nature within our school grounds. And then this month, we're looking at local sustainability projects. So if you're interested in any of those areas, the slides are already on the website. As well, if you'd like to be involved in any of our upcoming projects, you can just drop me a message and get involved. So if you have any questions from today's session, get in touch with me on the app as well, and I'm happy to answer questions on the app. I've just put some logos, actually. I'll make that screen a bit bigger, of organisations you might want to get in contact with or explore a little bit further if you're interested. These have all been helpful to what I'm achieving with my Enviro Ed group. So all of these have been able to feed into that, really. And they're all really great for further information.